What is a man? But a miserable pile of secrets.
The original Castlevania Lords of Shadow was an okay game. It wasn't incredible, it didn't really honor the legacy of the Castlevania series like fans had hoped it would, but at the end of the day, it was a pretty alright action title. It was passable, but certainly not remarkable. That is until after the end credits rolled. It's impossible to discuss the game's successor, Lords of Shadow 2, without first spoiling the original game's biggest surprise, so if you were still planning on playing through the series, you should go ahead and stop this video right now. After a relatively unexciting 17-hour campaign, Lords of Shadow threw a massive wrench in the machine with its epilogue, where we jump hundreds of years into the future to discover that since the original ending, Gabriel had become Dracula and taken up residence in an abandoned cathedral. This left a lot of people, myself included, excited by the prospect of a sequel. Not only would the developer have a chance to learn from all the mistakes they made in the original, but they would be giving us an exciting new setting that for the most part we haven't explored in a Castlevania game. So how did all that work out? Well, not so well, unfortunately. Lords of Shadow 2 opens with you ascending an enormous robot while simultaneously fighting off numerous paladins out for your head. Remember those Titan fights from the original game? Well, hopefully you weren't too crazy about them because this is the only one that you're going to see in the sequel. The action culminates with you defeating your enemies and destroying the Titan by vomiting blood all over its robotic brain. If you're thinking, wow, there can't possibly be anywhere to go from there, you're unfortunately correct. Though the game attempts to bring you more spectacle, it never actually manages to top its own opening hour. After the game's opening, you are of course stripped of all your powers, and you begin its primary plotline, which involves Dracula helping out his old nemesis Zobek to ward off an attack on the world by the first game's original villain, Satan. The plot is all over the place, and ranges from tongue-in-cheek to deadpan serious. No matter what the tone, the whole thing just feels goofy. Dracula's goals and aspirations are difficult to follow, so much so that the game does its best to remind you of exactly what it is you're working towards every time you get a game over. Before allowing you to begin your game again, you first have to watch Dracula lament about his current situation before making a dramatic face when you hit the start button.
The Acolytes must keep the antidote in a safe place. There is a conclave in the Basilica in the city. The last Acolyte is there.
Have I left the iron on in the house? If you haven't played the DLC from the original, or the 3DS game that everybody hated, then you might not be familiar with some of the characters and items that you'll encounter in Lords of Shadow 2. Although you can limp along without that knowledge, you still may find yourself confused in certain situations, like when you're tasked with tracking down the Mirror of Fate so that your ghost son Trevor can play with his dolls more effectively. The game gives you a lot of upgrades to choose from, all of them combo-based. There's definitely a greater number of attacks than there were in the first game, but I still felt a little raw unlocking a lot of moves that were identical to what I had before. Lords of Shadow certainly wasn't known for its world-class puzzles, but what sits in their place here is something much, much worse. Have you ever thought to yourself, man, this Castlevania game is great, but I sure do wish I could play as a rat? Or, boy, I love Castlevania, but where are all the stealth sections? Yeah, I didn't think so. Well, apparently the folks over at Mercury Steam have been having these thoughts pretty frequently. The first enemies that you will encounter in the modern world are some hulking tanks lugging around giant cannons. Dracula, it's explained, is in a weakened state from his years of sleep, and so it's deemed best to avoid these enemies, instead choosing to throw bats at them or mutate into a rat in order to sneak on past them. You will actually complete the game without ever successfully being able to fight one of these enemies. You'll also topple demons and monsters 3 times their scope, size, and power, which makes your inability to defeat them even more frustrating. Stealth sections aren't just limited to weird future monsters. At one point in the game, you're forced to hide from a boss in a graveyard. In order to move forward, you'll find yourself throwing knives at bells hanging on the wall and steering clear of piles of dead leaves on the ground lest their crinkle alert him to your location. Why do you need to hide from him? Who knows? Once you sneak past the zone, you fight him just like a normal boss. My initial excitement about the game's new setting waned when I saw how familiar all of it was. It was almost like a group of men in a boardroom asked, how do we create a new locale for this series? And someone said, just make it look like the old locales, but add roads and abandoned cars. Heading back to Dracula's castle is even worse. I suppose you could argue that the lack of environment variety is to be expected when you force the game into one complete map, but games like Dark Souls did the same thing and never seemed to have any trouble making their environments stand out. Almost nothing presented in Lords of Shadow 2 feels like a step forward for the series. The slight variations in the combat are uninteresting, the setting and environments all feel bland, even the bosses feel muted compared to your encounters in the first game. I think if Enemy Slime had existed when Lords of Shadow came out, I probably would have awarded it an average score of 3. Since Lords of Shadow 2 is a step back in almost every conceivable way, I feel like it's most appropriate for it to take a 2 out of 5.